Since 2018, the podcast Who Killed is focused on crimes that may have been forgotten.
It's a mix of investigative journalism and interviews which follow stories over months or even years.
We're going to dive into the show and offer our thoughts.
That's on this episode of So Much Crime,
So Little Time. Before we start the show, just a reminder, check us out on Patreon. Dee, did you know we have a Patreon?
What?
We do. It's patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time. It's a great place to get a bunch of fun stuff. We put extra content that isn't in these episodes. We give you early access to future shows. We'll even take your suggestions if there's shows you want us to cover. We're going to be doing that on one of our upcoming shows. And you get that great feeling of supporting us in making this show. So check us out at patreon.com/so-much-crime, so little time. Welcome to So Much Crime, So Little Time. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Dee, and in this episode we'll introduce you to Who Killed, a podcast from Slow Burn Media.
If you haven't listened to Who Killed, that's no problem. You can start here, or you can check out our interview with host Bill Huffman. That's the one before this one in your feed. Both this episode and the interview are a great way to introduce yourself to the show and to Bill.
You'll also find a link to Who Killed in our show notes.
All right, it's time to discuss if we think this is a crime show that's worth your time. So Who Killed is a show that started in 2018. It originally was a short series called Who Killed Amy Mihaljevic. The host is Bill Huffman.
There are over 350 episodes as of 2024. Wild. Also, when you need a show that's got a lot for your long journeys, your transatlantic flights, wherever you're going, your road trips, where you don't want to talk to the person beside you, we like a silent car. This is a really good show to turn to. Most episodes are just over the hour mark in length. And let's jump in, Jeff. How is the format unique or interesting?
So it's a sort of a case of the week type show, which we've talked about before, but he also spends a lot of time coming back to cases and doing updates on cases. So if you go through the feed, you'll see a big mix of episodes where he's doing like a short series or a couple of episodes on the same topic. Sometimes they're focused on really famous cases like John Wayne Gacy, or he does cases about people that you've never heard of. And that's kind of the voice to the voiceless idea. Sometimes he's doing interviews. He has interviews with all kinds of interesting people. Sometimes they're people who are personally connected to a case, like a family member or a friend of someone who was a victim. Sometimes he's talking to journalists, people who've written books on cases, people who are local media or law enforcement. He also will include in his feed press conferences, so updates, news updates, basically from cases that he's covered in the past. You can kind of go through kind of linearly through his feed and just kind of listen to a whole smattering of different cases. You can also go to the show wherever you listen, Spotify or wherever, and just search for a particular case and see all the times he's covered it over the years. There's really a big variety of styles of episode and types of content in the show.
I think maybe one thing that I found particularly interesting about this show, look, I'm not going to lie, I wasn't overly eager to start listening.
Why?
I just wasn't. Sometimes you're just like, your gut feeling is, nah, not for you, but you do it anyway. When I jumped in, I realized, and especially after talking to Bill, but even from listening to the episodes, my opinion changed. Sometimes I feel like when podcasts are doing like a one-off episode or a couple of episodes on a particular crime, there's no depth. It's regurgitating things that are already happening. What I feel like is different from Who Killed is it seems like a lot of investigation and research has gone into every single case. And I'd love to know, actually, and it's not something I asked Bill today, but maybe I'll ask him the next time I see him, that I say that as if we're best mates. Does he give the same amount of research, the same amount of time does he devote it to each case? Obviously, with the Amy Mihaljevic case, that was a short series. He went in hard. He spoke to a lot of people. There was a lot of research done. But surely when you're producing this week over week, you can't do that. And I think he alluded to that, like it had to change a little bit in order to make this sustainable. I just thought he gave a lot of grace to each episode that I listened to. He had a lot of investigation, a lot of research, and a lot of thoughts and feelings that I felt like were unique.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think something that stood out to me the more I listened to it was he also has this incredible recall for the stories that he's done. And he's able to bring up details, names, years, just the facts about cases that he may have covered years ago, but just the sort of encyclopedic knowledge of some of the cases he's covered suggests to me that he's done a significant amount of research, as well as he feels a closeness to these cases and to some of these people.
Yeah, and I get that. And I will say it's one thing that I struggled with, because I kind of get from the episodes that there's a real strong who killed community out there who are along with him for the journey, and they are there with him for his investigation and for his episodes. But I haven't been. And so sometimes I just got lost, purely, obviously, because I'm listening to an episode and a connection or a comment relating to a separate case that he's previously covered in a different episode. That connection, like I don't have the context for that.
I wanted to ask you a question about that, actually.
Okay.
So my question for you, and I mean, I have my own personal thoughts on this, but if you were to recommend to someone that wanted to check out this show, what type of episode or where might you suggest they start?
Stopped at the very beginning. No,
well,
not a very good place to start. I actually think I would suggest that they start at the very beginning, because my point, before you interrupted me, which is totally allowed because I talk a lot, is that what I was going to say is, what would Annette Walsh say? Annette Walsh is my mother. She would say, who owns the problem? And it's me. I'm the problem. It's me, because I haven't listened to his previous episodes. And so he is saying, I feel like when he's giving that context, he's like, be a part of the community. The only gripe I have with that is it has to be open. It has to be inviting for anyone to start at any stage. And maybe that's something that I would, we just interviewed him and I have 2 questions to ask him, because he does mention other episodes. Does he care? We've been given feedback in our recaps that people are like, well, what if I haven't listened to the podcast that you're discussing? You need to give me more context. And we've gone back and forth over saying, well, who owns the problem? Okay, so one other thing I wanted to note about Who Killed is I really do feel like he manages to do this while exploring all of the not so nice or not so appetizing scenarios that could have maybe led to the murders, which I noted in one of the murders one of the cases that I covered that I'd like to talk to you about. I listened to the case of Madeleine McCann, which I have discussed with you. I've brought up previously and you had never heard of. So this was a reason I chose it, but I also chose it because I remembered this happening. I remember her going missing.
When did this happen and what's the story?
So in 2006, Madeleine McCann was 3 and her parents took her with a couple of other families. A group of families went to a resort in Portugal, in the Algarve, and they got into a rhythm of going for meals, like about a football field between the restaurant they would have gone to and the apartments that the kids were staying in. So they could see the front door to the apartments. And every 30 minutes or so, one of the grown-ups, one of the adults would go and check on the kids. And they had done this for a few nights in a row, same restaurant, kind of just, that was the vibe. So Madeleine was staying with her 2 younger siblings. I think there was twins, or 2 older, maybe. Her siblings who were twins. And basically at one point, someone goes to check and Madeleine is gone. And that's the story. She was abducted. She has never been found, and it was everywhere. I remember in 2006, it was everywhere. This little blonde girl, like chubby little cheeks, like a 3-year-old. She had a very distinctive mark in her eye. The pupil bled a little bit into the iris, and so like it was very distinctive. So the reason I chose this was because I saw he covered it kind of recently enough. He replayed the 2020 episode that he had done on my Passion Case feed with the captain from one of the co-hosts of True Crime Garage. So he was like talking to him about it because they both knew a lot about the case. So that's the first introduction we get, and then we get like an updates episode that was published in 2022. And so I've given you the summary of what happened with the case, but what I like, there's a lot I could go into here.
How did you feel he covered this?
I thought it was very interesting because they brought up things that maybe I hadn't been as aware of. And it is, I hate to use the word fascinating, but it is a really fascinating case because nothing has ever come from it. And unfortunately, there's so many weird twists and turns to it. I thought he covered it really well. I'd like to make a point that Bill Huffman doesn't shy away. He's very respectful to the cases, but he doesn't shy away from discussing the potentially uncomfortable or unappetizing conspiracies or potential theories for how someone has died or what might have happened. And in this episode, I felt like it was interesting because he didn't shy away from the fact that both the parents of Kate and Jerry, Madeleine McCann's parents, were under suspicion for a while. And he doesn't shy away from that. He doesn't lean into it in a salacious manner, but he says, you know, there are certain things that come up that are odd. And, you know, certain theories that come up that I don't give any heed to, like the theory that they were X or Y or Z. But he also still mentions them by even mentioning that he doesn't give any heed to them. So I feel like he deals with them in a respectful manner without compromising the story. And I think that is one of the strengths from what I've seen so far of Who Killed.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think that was also my experience. I think it's interesting that you listened to one about a story that you already knew a bunch about.
Yes. Since having kids, I feel like I've really shied away from listening to stories where kids are the victims, particularly probably kids who are a similar age to my children. So when these episodes came out, I just wouldn't go near them because I'm not there yet. I wouldn't be able to give any sort of comment on them, but because I knew this story, I felt that I would be able to bring up things that I can't mention.
Yeah.
I don't want to do a full recap yet on a story of this nature. I'm just not ready for it. And I suppose because I know my limits, I'm like, well, I know of this story, so my limits are slightly expanded for hearing some of it. Now, I will say one thing. My very first line on reviewing this is I shouldn't have listened. I wasn't even ready for it, but I did it. Not that that's anything to be proud of. I feel like if I was to do it over again, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't listen.
But that's more about your kind of where you are personally and what you sort of can tolerate, what type of story.
Nothing to do with how they dealt with it. I actually feel like they dealt with it in a very respectful manner, but a comment was made during it that put me down a rabbit hole. The captain from True Crime Garage, he basically said that people always assume that. So in the end of this, right, they ask each other, like, what is your theory? There's so many theories out here. What do you really believe will happen? Neither of them believe that this is ever going to be solved. And one of the theories is basically it was a robbery gone wrong. And the other theory was basically the robbery gone wrong thing leads into the fact that they have said people dismiss how sex rings and paedophilia rings are embedded in a lot of crime, and how basically if someone is going in, a robbery happened in the same complex like a couple of weeks before the McCanns arrived there. They would not have been aware of it. The resort will not tell you if a robbery has happened there. And what they think was like maybe someone spotted Madeleine. Maybe someone said there's a rake of children there. go in and get one. So it might have been, we're going to get a, or maybe someone said, we're looking for this type of child. And while they were robbing, they were like, well, this is a great opportunity. And I know, and your face is doing what my heart has done in the last few days, where I'm just like, I can't deal with this. But one of the comments that came from this was how, and it actually ended up being the Gacy thing, I didn't realize was going to be down the same path, which it ended up being. That's the other one I listened to, was that like predators and like pedophiles and convicted sex abusers are kind of everywhere. And a comment was made like, if you only just look at the sex registry in your area. So 2 nights ago, what did I do? Yeah.
Really?
And I'm like, I just didn't want to know this. I hate that I know this now. Anyway, why this made such a connection to this story, obviously because Madeleine McCann was taken, but what they bring in here, which I think I knew, but I probably blanked out. What happened a couple of weeks after Madeleine McCann went missing, is a guy called Clement Freud, who was a well-known British podcaster and politician, the grandson of Sigmund Freud. He escaped Nazi Germany and moved to England and became like an MP, a member of parliament there. He even received a knighthood, so technically he's Sir Clement Freud. He befriended the McCanns a couple of weeks after Madeleine McCann went missing, 2 months after. And he said like, oh, I have a villa over near here. I can help you navigate the system here because I'm familiar with the Portuguese system. After he died in 2009, 7 years after he died, a number of women came forward to make public allegations of child sexual abuse against him and rape, which led the police to investigate him. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about this, but I think we should discuss this case further.
Yeah, I listened to a little bit of the John Wayne Gacy one. That was a multi-part one, and I didn't get through it because that was hard to listen to. Just that the subject matter I found difficult. I went back and listened to the Amy Mihaljevic, the original.
Interesting.
I listened to the first episode of it. It's like a 6-part series originally, and then he's done some follow-up since. I actually thought that has held up really well, and I would definitely recommend listening to that because it's both clear that it's a case that is personally very close to Bill. I mean, he was the same age as her. So this is a 10-year-old girl who was kidnapped and murdered in the Cleveland area in 1989.
She was 3 miles from him?
Yeah, so it was right near where he grew up. It was a really unusual case in that. So she's a 10-year-old girl. It's 1989. She had received a phone call from a man who basically said, "Hey, your mom just got this promotion at work. Let's go buy her a gift." And they agreed to meet up at this mall. So she was...
What age was she?
10 years old. So she went to the mall with her friends, and so some people saw her then go with this man. So there were some witnesses who were able to describe him, but they never caught him, and she was found murdered a while later. One thing I wanted to say about that first episode, I thought he did a really wonderful job, Bill Huffman, of kind of setting the scene and like putting you in that time and place and describing sort of where the world was in 1989, and then also the kind of macro environment of what was going on in the world, and then the sort of micro environment of the Cleveland area, the suburb where this happened. Similarly, one of his big cases that he's covered is the Delphi murders, which, do you know anything about those?
Mm-mm.
So this is a single case. This is from Indiana, and it's these 2 girls, Libby German and Abby Williams. So they were out one afternoon, and this was in 2017. And so one of the girls' older sister, Kelsey German, dropped them off to go for a hike. So they were on a hike on this bridge, kind of in a wooded area, and they disappeared. And so they were found murdered. And one of the really interesting parts of this case is that there was, on one of their phones, so they found one of the girls' phones, there was video and audio that seemed to portray the guy who was pursuing them. Like they just happened to capture an image of this guy and some audio of him, and they still didn't manage to catch him. But so Bill has done several episodes on that case, But one of the ones that I thought was really fascinating was he had the sister, Kelsey German, who was the one who dropped them off, and he interviewed her. So he had met her at CrimeCon, and he did a multi-part interview with her. At the time he interviewed her, she was a freshman in college. He handled it incredibly well. You know, this is a few years after her sister and her sister's friend were murdered. She was the one who dropped them off on this trail. And she has since become an advocate for bringing attention to this case and trying to make people remember them and find out who killed them. So,
How old did you say they were when they passed away or when they were murdered?
they were 13 and 14. Yeah. But anyway, so I thought he handled that really well. I think that was a difficult interview.
Yeah, I can't imagine that. Like probably trying to give her space to speak.
One of the things, and this is true of that one, and this is true of other ones, because one of the other ones I listened to was on the New Bedford Highway Killer. So this was a serial killer in Massachusetts. And the one I listened to, I think, was a compilation of 2 episodes he did. One was he was just reporting on it and kind of describing it. And then the second half was an interview with a woman who is a journalist in the area, local journalist who has covered it. And so this is a woman who is like a veteran journalist. This crime happened, I think it was about 30 or 35 years ago, and she's been there for a long time. So she's a professional journalist, which is very different from talking to a teenage sister of a victim. And it was a very different kind of interview. And I thought it was interesting to hear how he handled those 2 things completely differently. I don't know. I thought they were very well done, but very different in tone.
That's why it would make sense, because he has such a background and so much experience in journalism himself.
Yeah.
And holding interviews or facilitating them. And
He does, but I also think one of the things that I think I've grown to sort of like we talked about how it can be a little bit hard to find an entry point, because he brings up these cases and I think it's more of a challenge in the interview ones. I think if you're listening to the ones where he's more reporting on a case, then there's less of that sort of mentioning, like sort of like dropping in different cases without a lot of context. But one of the things I liked about the way he does interviews is I think despite all of his journalistic background, there's an informality to them. Like they're very human. They're very real. They're not overly polished and slick.
yeah, I like that. I like how he leaves in a few mistakes he makes and things like that. I feel like that gives that not polished, slick nature, which I find endearing with these types of podcasts.
Yeah. It's not Dateline, right? It's not.
Yeah, well, I think sometimes slick comes off as sleazy.
Yeah. Yeah. This isn't that.
And I think with this genre in particular, it's a fine line.
Well, there's one other one I wanted to talk about.
Go for it.
Do you know who Bob Crane is?
Mm-mm.
Have you ever heard of the TV show Hogan's Heroes?
Like Hulk Hogan?
No.
Oh, no.
So Bob Crane was the star of the sitcom Hogan's Heroes, which was on in like the late 60s, early 70s. I remember seeing it.
Oh, you probably remember from your childhood. I wasn't born yet. For those of you who cannot see, which is all of you, he just stuck up his finger at me.
I remember watching the show in reruns as a kid. And it's a bizarre show because it's a sitcom, just a standard old time sitcom. But the setting is Bob Crane is the head of a group of POWs in a German prisoner of war camp. And so the Nazis
So funny.
are like comical villains.
Okay.
And then the prisoners are I think they're like officers. It's kind of like The Great Escape. Did you ever see The Great Escape?
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's kind of a play on that, but it's playing up the sort of like silly comedy element of it. But the setting is so serious and so dark. I mean, it's Nazis and prisoners of war. But anyway, so Bob Crane was a huge star for a few years while that show was on the air. After that show was on the air, he very kind of quickly sort of fell out of the spotlight and couldn't really find another starring role. And he was doing community theater in kind of the middle of nowhere, and he gets murdered. But then it's a mystery. I don't think it was ever solved. But one of the things that sort of was an element to this case was he was super into pornography, like creating his own.
Oh.
Yeah. So
In the 70s?
yes. So there's Polaroids, like still photos, and yeah. Anyway, so there's this.
I don't think you're like, yeah, your face, yeah.
But there, so that's what was kind of swirling around him, was like, was this retribution? Because he would basically like drop into town and just go to the bar and pick up women and go from there. Anyway, there was a movie that came out. No, we don't need to
Go from there.
Anyway, I thought it was interesting because he's done a couple of these cases that are a little bit more famous, but maybe aren't very well remembered. And like, so this is a guy, like I remember watching this guy on a sitcom. I knew he got murdered. I didn't really know much about it, but it was kind of an interesting way to learn a little bit more about this sort of obscure story about a famous person, but a famous person who I think not a lot of people maybe remember.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think that goes back to what you were saying originally with like how unique this is. Like, it's such a variety of cases. I feel oftentimes true crime podcasts get into like a very narrow section of crime.
Yeah.
And it seems like either that or they do one-off episodes that aren't very deep. It's just very much like, this is the overview of what happened. Ha ha ha. This is weird. Bye bye bye. Whereas this is kind of like marrying the two together, where he's like deep diving into very different stories, like across like popular versus like not really well known, or as you said in that case, like a well-known person but not a well-known story, and a lot of people have forgotten that he was a well-known person, and does a deep dive. So it's kind of more than the surface level, this is just the story and isn't this wild. It's like deeper than that, and he tries to do that, and I think that's what makes this kind of unique.
Yeah, I guess maybe in the end, do you feel like this is a show that's worth people's time, is worth investigating?
Yes, I think this is a podcast that is worth people's time. I think this is a crime. These are crimes that is worth your time. So what about you, Jeff?
Yeah, I agree. I also think, as we've been talking about, I think it is worth going back to some of the early episodes and checking those out, as well as, or just like you did, maybe looking for an episode that you're maybe already familiar with the case.
Yeah.
And that might be a good entry point as well. But there's over 350 episodes. There's lots of places to jump in.
So many places to jump in. It's a good one. Don't forget to join us on Patreon. You'll get early access to shows, bonus content, and you'll support us in making this show. It's patreon.com/so much crime, so little time. And while you're at it, go ahead, rate us, give us 5 stars, Spotify. What are the other ones? Apple. Anywhere. Wherever someone's asking for a good true crime podcast, just say So Much Crime, So Little Time. That's all you have to say. Follow us on Instagram. Tell your friends. Tell your frenemies. Tell everyone.
All right, Dee, next time we're going to do something really special. We're going to talk about a podcast that was recommended to us by one of our Patreon subscribers. All right, we're going to go to the Bronx in New York. It's the early 90s. So this is about a couple of young drug dealers who were at this intersection that was known as the Corner on Blood. And so there was the boss and his protege. The boss, Calvin, was living the good life as drug dealing boss, but then things went sour, and the protege accused the boss, Calvin, of a double homicide.
Wow.
So this is a story about Calvin going to prison for a crime that he says he didn't commit. So it's called Empire on Blood. Interesting thing about this is this was a podcast that came out originally back in 2018, but in 2024, a new version of it came out. So the creator basically got back the rights and made like a director's cut of it with some extra content. So
oh my God, it's like Taylor's version.
we're going to listen to Taylor's version of Empire on Blood. Yes.
This sounds fascinating. It also sounds very different.
So Empire on Blood.
That's next time on So Much Crime,
So Little Time. So Much Crime, So Little Time is a production of Mind Glove Media. The executive producer is Paxton Caloriso. Our associate producer is Blythe Ty. Our theme music was composed by Vyacheslav Starostin. If you haven't done it yet, please subscribe to this show on your podcast app. And don't forget to give us a 5-star rating and a review. Even better, tell your friends. To join the discussion, look for us on social media. Check out the show notes for all the links. Thanks for listening.